Okay, welcome everyone. Again, apologies for the delay. I'm sorry, I'm gonna stand in front of you, otherwise the people on the live stream can see me. Yeah, the delay is also because now we can also invite people who are watching through the live stream. It'll also be recorded, so also if you have the need to watch it again, you can. So yeah, also welcome to everyone here physically today at the university for this panel on debt cancellation for Global South countries. We're really happy to welcome you in a special space today because we are doing this at the same time while there's a university occupation by Activism Barcelona. And also before we begin, we would like to express our thanks to the Degrowth Masters, ICTA and Activism Barcelona for providing us this space. The idea for this talk came up when we saw a call to action by the Debt for Climate campaign in the context of the 70th anniversary of the London Agreement. And under this agreement, Germany's debt that accumulated before, during, after the Second World War was cancelled by over 50%. However, at the same time, debt cancellations for countries in the Global South have been denied for decades. So how is it possible that Germany's war debts were cancelled in the name of economic development, while demands by political figures for the Global South asking for the same thing have been violently denied for decades? We started wondering why and how debt was created in the Global South and why it is not being cancelled. So we decided to turn to our three speakers of today. We have here Esteban Servat, Iolanda Fresnillo, and Hickel. Thank you for being here. And so hopefully we will find answers to those questions and to explore how debt cancellation can be achieved and what we can also do as activists located in the Global North to support movements led by activists from the Global South. We would also like to say thank you to Debt for Climate for their collaboration in organizing this event, and Clàudia Custodio from the NGO Debt Observatory in Globalization for taking on the role today as moderator. We wish you all a fruitful discussion, and I will now pass it on to you, Clàudia.
Okay, do you hear me? Yes, perfect. Yeah, so as Laura said, well, thanks for the introduction. Today we're gonna talk about or discuss, why in the situation that some countries in the Global South find themselves right now, that they are in heavy debt distress, but their debts are not cancelled, despite we know that this has been done before. Specifically, we mentioned Germany, this year is the 70th anniversary of the cancellation of 50% of their debts. And the reason why this debt was cancelled was because it hindered its economic development. And despite now, this situation of debt distress is also hindering the economic development of many countries. Debt is not cancelled. Why is that so? So we're going to look first at the past a little bit, like how did we get here, how did these countries get so indebted. Then we're going to look at the situation right now, and we will try to end looking at the way forward, or what are the next steps we can take to achieve this debt cancellation. To talk about this, we have these three speakers that Laura introduced already. We have with us Esteban Servat. He's an Argentinian scientist and Freudian environmental activist. Currently he's based in Germany, and he has been connecting grassroots movements and activist groups targeting fossil fuel companies between the Global South and North, including Shale Must Fall, Winter Shale Must Fall, Global Coastline Rebellion, and specifically why we invited him today here is Debt for Climate. And later we will see what that campaign is about. Then we have with us Iolanda Fresnillo. She has been a debt activist for over 2 decades. Iolanda is now coordinating the debt justice work at Eurodat, which is the European Network on Debt and Development. And she's very active in several global spaces on debt and financing for development. And she's also written several reports on the intersection of debt, climate, and gender justice. And finally, we have with us Jason Hickel, who's an economic anthropologist originally from Eswatini. That's correct. He's a professor at the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the university. And his research focused on global political economy, inequality, and ecological economics. And his ethnographic work focuses on colonialism and anti-colonial struggles. And maybe you've heard about it, but he's the author of Less is More, How the Group Will Save the World, and The Divide, A Brief Guide to Global Inequality and Its Solutions. So that being said, I will just mention that in the end we'll open up the floor for questions that you might have for people here present and also for the online people. And we will say them loud so that everyone has the opportunity to ask questions that maybe I haven't asked. Yes. All right, so let's start. So Yolanda, according to the United Nations Development Programme, in the end of 2022, there were 54 countries in the Global South that were in this situation of acute debt distress, which heavily impacts their ability to make decisions on their budget and implement social policies. Could you perhaps explain how did they get in this situation and how was this debt created and who were the major actors involved?
Okay, thank you. Bona tarda. Good afternoon, everyone. First, thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here, not only because this is here in Catalonia, and it's not very frequent that we end up talking about debt here, but also because it's with Debt for Climate, which I've been wanting to collaborate more, and also with Jason, whom I admire a lot, so it's amazing to be here. Second is that I already told them like this question could last like 2 hours explaining, but let me just give you a few hints. The first, I think it's probably obvious to everyone, but I think it's worth stating it, which is, I mean, the roots of the debt can be tracked back to colonialism, to historical debts, but particularly to the structural roots of debt, so the economic imbalances in the world that make that countries in the Global South acquire debts to cover fiscal deficits that could be covered if there wasn't illicit financial flows, if there wasn't tax havens, if there wasn't unequal trade, if there wasn't nature exploitation, if there wasn't capitalism. So at the end, you have a structural roots of the situation. But there are also some circumstantial elements that can be taken into account for this precise crisis. So we can go back to the crisis in the 80s and the 90s. There was a huge debt crisis in the Global South, starting in Latin America, but also in African and Asian countries. The crisis in the 80s and 90s ended up with a bailing out, a rescue of the banks, of the private sector, by indebting the countries more. So the IMF, the World Bank, lending the countries to be able to repay the debts to the private sector. And then for a few countries, like 40 countries, with debt cancellation. So around 40 countries, particularly mainly from Africa, but some from Latin America and Asia, got debt cancellation in the late 90s and early 2000s through what was called the Hickel Initiative. The Hickel Initiative was a Trojan horse because they were offered this debt cancellation, in some cases up to 90% of the debt stock, so it was important for some cases. But that was attached to an IMF program and the implementation of neoliberal, like classic neoliberal policies, privatization, structural reforms, liberalization, deregulation of the financial system, the regulation of the labor system. So the countries that we have today are also the countries that had to apply those measures in the 90s and 80s. In other cases, that also happened without the debt cancellation. So IMF programs, rescuing, like bailing out the countries, but not rescuing, really giving more money to be able to pay the creditors, and then in exchange applying the structural adjustment programs, which is neoliberal recipe. We get to the mid-2000s, and what happened is that there is a commodity boom. So countries receiving more money because of exploiting their natural resources and exporting those natural resources. This level of debt cancellation for some countries as well. Low interest rates, so decreasing interest rates, particularly after the 2008 crisis in the global north. And because of the low interest rates in the global north and the policy of quantitative easing, so the central banks buying the public debt in the global north, the financial markets were looking for clients. Like, okay, who will pay me more for my money? Who will pay me more for my lending? And what happened is that many global south countries, particularly in Africa, not only, also in Latin America and Asia, but in Africa that hadn't happened before, issued a lot of debt. So got indebted with financial markets, issued bonds in the financial markets. I know this might be complicated, but got a lot of debt, but because of, there was money there. There was reckless lending from the financial markets at low interest rates, higher than the ones in Europe or in the US, but low interest rates. So for many countries, it was easy to just, okay, let's get this money and do whatever, infrastructures, corruption, public policies, that depends on each case. There was also a huge lending from China. Countries got China lending because it was better than IMF or World Bank lending. It was without conditionalities, without policy conditionalities. And it was helping them develop infrastructure. So I want an airport, I want a port, I want this highway, and China is going to give me the money and build the highway, build the airport, build whatever. Then we got to COVID, the economic shock, and debts multiplied in these countries. But the debt crisis was already there before COVID. And it's not just us saying that, but if you look at the IMF and World Bank reports, they were already saying that there was a debt problem before the COVID. COVID, the crisis in Ukraine, inflation, countries that are importing food and energy are particularly suffering because they have to pay higher prices, and interest rates have gone way up. And that means that countries have to pay way more on debt. If you look at the debt for GDP ratio, the situation in the global south might be not so bad because it's lower, for instance, than in Spain. Most countries are even below 60% of the GDP on debt. But what is happening in the global south is that countries are devoting most of their resources to paying very expensive debts. So what is happening is that these debts are eating up the resources for the recovery after the COVID pandemic and after the impacts of the crisis. I'm going to leave it there because I could continue like for ages.
Thank you. Okay, so from what you said, I gather that the main actors involved here have been the IMF and the World Bank, have appeared here several times. Also the banks, I assume, like actors in the financial system. And then do countries just maybe, yeah, you can answer quickly, but then we will pass it to Jason.
Just one thing, it's not so much the banks as the investment funds, the BlackRocks of the world, which are the main actor here, and China.
So countries in the global south are mostly in debt with these actors, yeah. Cool. Okay, so now we're moving on to Jason. Maybe you can try to explain us how is this debt for the global south related to the current capitalist system?
Okay.
Briefly, shortly.
Less than like 10 seconds, I'll cover that. So yeah, let's think. Why are the debts not being cancelled? The debts are not being cancelled because they are foundational to the way that global capital accumulation operates. Foundational. And I mean that in this very specific sense. Without going into the history that Iolanda very beautifully covered. Capitalism requires an imperial arrangement, right? This is like imperialism for capital is not a side gig. It is a structurally necessary feature for capital accumulation, okay? Because think about it, what is capitalism? What is capital accumulation? It constantly requires an ever-increasing appropriation of the surplus. To achieve that, you have to cheapen labor and resources and supplies, right? I mean, this is the basics of capital accumulation. Within a domestic economy, an isolated domestic economy, you can only do this for so long before you run into real problems. You can't, I mean, if you sabotage your working class and your domestic ecological base, eventually this will cause contradictions that you can't resolve, no? And so the way that capitalism is always, from the very beginning, when it arose in the 1500s, resolved these contradictions is by shifting exploitation and appropriation to a third party that didn't have the ability to resist in the same kind of way. This is where the colonies came in, right? The rise of the global capitalist system depended utterly on appropriation from the colonies of the global south. This arrangement came under very heavy threats in the middle of the 20th century with the successful rise of anti-colonial movements, which began after achieving political independence, mobilizing production and labor and resources domestically around meeting domestic human needs, right? So what happens when this occurs? It means that there's less that is available for appropriation by the core economies in the global north, right? This caused a crisis of capital accumulation in the late 1970s. I mean, a really serious turning point for capital. Either we shift to some kind of post-colonial, post-capitalist economic system, or we somehow restore the imperial arrangements, you know? And they did that through debt. Debt was the instrument of reestablishing the imperial arrangements, okay? And it begins really with like the Volcker shock in 1980. Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, dramatically increases interest rates in the US. The idea was domestically to crush the power of labor unions in the US, therefore to re-cheapen labor domestically now. But the effect, whether it was intended or not, was to generate a massive debt crisis in the global south, okay? Totally artificially out of nowhere. I mean, interest rates went from 2-3% to 20% overnight. Who can pay that? You know? Countries very legitimately decided it's better for us to default. After all, we're nation states. We have the right to default. They proceeded to do so, and the U.S., recognizing this would pose an extraordinary threat to Western banks, which were overexposed to global south debts, intervened by imposing structural adjustment programs across the global south. Right? What did these do? I mean, as Iolanda said, they actively reversed the progressive policies of the post-colonial, anti-colonial movements. You know? They re-cheapened labor and resources and re-established the flows of appropriation that capital accumulation relies on. And we can see this very clearly in the empirical evidence today. That's consumption and accumulation in the global north relies overwhelmingly on a large net appropriation of labor, land, resources, energy from the global south. Okay? How do you maintain that kind of flow? It's through structural adjustments. It's critical. And you can only structurally adjust as long as you have some kind of debt arrangement in place. Creditors get to dictate the terms of economic policy. So think about what occurred here, right? Power over core decisions about macroeconomic policy were shifted from the democratic parliaments of the global south to technocrats and bankers in Washington, New York, and London. Right? I mean, it was an extraordinary coup that effectively demolished any real economic independence in the global south. You know? Because economic independence in the global south is a threat to capital. It's as simple as that. You don't operate the system unless you have subordination in the global south, and debt is the instrument of subordination. So why don't they cancel the debt? Because it's fundamentally, it's not just against the interests of the banks that hold the debt. It's fundamentally against the entire arrangements that perpetuates the kind of consumption and accumulation that is possible in the global north under this system. So I don't know, I mean, there's a million things to say, but that's my pitch to you.
Thank you. Okay, so now let's hear about what's the response from the global south. Esteban, you are involved in this Debt for Climate campaign. Can you maybe explain us a little bit what is this campaign doing, and if you got inspired by previous movements for debt cancellation?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for inviting us, to all the students who organized this panel. I think following on the explanations of Iolanda and Jason, as soon as we became independent from Spain, we, in Latin America, most of Latin America, we were right to become neo-colonies of England through debt, as Jason was saying. And I, in my case, come from an anti-fracking struggle, from frontline resistance against the destruction of our homelands. The global south is getting destroyed, it's getting sacrificed by multinational companies, mainly from here, from the global north, like Repsol from Spain and many others, that are doing on the other side of the world what they are not allowed to do here. And many of us have been doing international solidarity campaigns, trying to fight fracking, trying to fight mega mining, deforestation, offshore drilling. And we realize, like the rest of the climate movement, that we are losing. We are losing, we are playing catch up, things are getting quickly out of hand, and we just don't have enough power, because what Jason was saying, can only be changed by force, can only be changed by wielding power to change it. They will not automatically and voluntarily give up this power that they have over us. So in trying to think strategically and in trying to put in I've been in Europe for the last 4 years in Germany, working with different climate movements, and we feel that, especially 4 years ago, now it's changing, but the ideas of what's affecting most the people in the global south were quite absent from the agenda. There is colonialism also in the climate movement. And what gets started in Europe usually gets taken on in the global south as well. So we are importing the tendencies from Europe, but our problems are not on the agenda. Colonialism, extractivism, and even less debt. So we brought this movement together by bringing together all the groups that we've been working with for the last several years and trying to find a common denominator that can speak to enough groups that enables us to build the necessary power we have to build. And in that, the workers' unions cannot be absent. And that's why this picture is from our first global action last summer against the G7. Thousands of workers, the biggest worker unions of Argentina, mobilizing in downtown Buenos Aires for Debt for Climate. So by making the connection between debt and climate, we've managed to find a way to speak to the workers at a massive level, because even though workers, like in Europe, the climate crisis is not so high on the agenda, but debt in the global south is, because it's directly affecting their capacity to feed their family, to have a decent life. So by making this connection between debt and climate, which are completely connected because debt is driving extractivism to continue plundering the global south to send these cheap resources to feed the cycle of consumption and capitalism in Europe. By connecting this, we've managed to build a synthesis that speaks to indigenous movements, feminist movements, labor unions, of course, climate movements, and many others, even faith groups. You asked me what groups were inspired by or who preceded us. The Jubilee 2000 campaign did a lot of important work and managed to get some debt cancellation. Many of the groups there were faith groups, and I think it's an important group that we must not leave out. Because it's powerful, and the church has this jubilee every 25 years or so on. Not only Catholic, but like all kinds of faith groups are important. And I just think we need to think strategically and really find ways where we must be connecting to the labor unions. The workers must be the protagonists of the climate fight. We must not allow to be antagonized, where climate activists seem to be, they feel that we are targeting their jobs, that we're targeting them. This is a deep strategic mistake that we will all regret in the long run, as we will be the scapegoats of the fascist movements that are rising in Europe that are going to further antagonize us from the workers. If we don't have the workers as protagonists in the climate fight, might as well just hang your hat and go home because the fight is lost. So we're trying to build an alternative of hope, of international solidarity, where the workers have to be the protagonists. They are the ones that gave us all the social rights we enjoy today through more than a century of struggles and blood and death. So we must understand they are the champions of social change, not us. We are there to support, we are there to build a narrative, we are there to provide all the, start debates and things on the climate crisis, but I think we need to understand that the actor in society that has the power that we need is the worker unions, and put our energy into how can we help that transition happen sooner than later so that they can take on this protagonism. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, Yolanda, you were mentioning before that if we look at the government debt as ratio of their GDP, actually, like there are some countries, for example, in the USA, it is 115%. In France, it is 91%. In Argentina, it's 81%, and in Uganda, 51%. So why is debt less problematic there for Argentina, not the USA? I mean, Jason touched on like before, but maybe how should we look at that? Like, then why is that cancellation of demand from the global south and it's not even mentioned for the global north? Yeah.
First, GDP is a terrible indicator. I was going to say a bullshit indicator, but it didn't seem very serious. It's a terrible indicator, and debt to GDP doesn't tell us anything in reality, because I mean, debt to GDP decreased the last year globally because GDP increased, not because debt decreased. So yeah, it gives us the sense, or this is what they tell, of how much an economy has to pay that debt. But in reality, this debt is public debt. We're talking about sovereign debt. So the indicator that we actually look at is this debt payments versus the government revenue. So how much of what the government is receiving is being devoted to debt, which is for me the indicator that shows how much of this debt is transferred into people's burden. How much of the public services are being cut or are being privatized or in order to repay those debts. Debt service or debt payments in the global south have never been so high in absolute terms in history. Debt payments to GDP, debt payments to government revenue is at the highest since the worst moment of the crisis in the 90s. This is how much it matters for many countries in the global south. Their public resources are being devoted to repay the financial markets, China, the IMF, and the World Bank, mostly, and not to invest in public services, energy transition, climate adaptation, climate mitigation. So the other day, a colleague said this sentence that I think it's really right. That is killing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. That is killing any chance to fight against climate, because it's eating up all the money. The other problem is that for some countries, they are getting to the moment that they don't have the reserves to pay back, so they are in default. The number of defaults has never been this high, even in the crisis in the 80s, in such a short period of time. So countries like Zambia, like Sri Lanka, like Suriname, Ecuador a little bit last year, Argentina 2 years ago, Lebanon, Ghana, they can't pay their debts anymore. They defaulted. Sometimes they get a restructuring and they go to pay back to paying, like Ecuador or Argentina. But in the case of Suriname, of Sri Lanka, of Zambia, of Ghana, they are just not able to pay. There is a monetary currency issue here also that links to the valuation of the local currencies and how this has eaten up the country's reserves. But there is an issue also of debts being unpayable because of the high interest rates. Zambia, if they wanted to refinance that debt, they were being asked for 18% of interest rate. In the last attempt to refinance, they said, well, that's an impossible interest rate, so they defaulted. And the risk is that there are other countries on the verge of default. Yeah, and don't get me wrong, default shouldn't be the worst case scenario. In some cases, default is the best case scenario. If you have to choose between keep paying your creditors and investing in your public services or importing food in a food crisis, well, you should choose for the second and not for the first. So default might be the best option for some countries. And actually, for instance, in the case of Zambia, what is happening is that the social investments in these last 2 years that they haven't been paying have gone up. The problem is that they are negotiating with the IMF and they are negotiating with the creditors. So at the end of this process, there's going to be a push down again. So it's because debt is threatening economic, social, cultural rights, it's threatening human rights, it's threatening the fight against climate, and it has and it will have a huge human cost. And we know that because it's happening now, but we know that because it happened before in the crisis in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s in countries like Argentina and countries like Ecuador. It causes massive migration because people have to flee their countries because there's no economic options in there. And we know that this is what is going to happen unless there is a massive debt cancellation or a massive debt repudiation. I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah, actually, yeah, do you want to add something? And no, it just remind me that actually the IMF and the World Bank have acknowledged the situation of like the debt, like well, cannot continue because it's just yeah, unbearable. But still, no, they haven't openly advocated for debt cancellation, and instead they are proposing other instruments such as what they call climate debt swaps or conditional debt cancellations. Yeah, what do you think about these instruments, Jason, Esteban?
I think you should speak to that if you want, or Yolanda.
Bullshit. The solution to the problems will not come from the source of the problems. The IMF and the World Bank are the institutions that have led us to this debt crisis, are largely responsible for the climate crisis. So we know that anything that comes from these sources is nothing but greenwashing attempts that mask their true interest, which is continued domination and plundering and exploitation of the global south. So I think Yolanda has a lot more to add on this than me, but basically debt swaps are a disguised attempt for a large NGO from the global north, like WWF, to take over territories of land, sometimes displacing indigenous people. And the amount of, it's not debt cancellation, it's not sovereign, it's under the conditions imposed by the IMF or the World Bank.
So
And
could you perhaps explain how do they work, climate debt swaps?
Yeah, basically, so I think you wanted to talk about this one.
Just quickly, so that
I
everyone
can.
knows what we're talking
So
about.
historically, debt swaps was okay. A country has a debt to another country or a private creditor, and there is a small debt cancellation. Normally, it's very small, and the country has the commitment to invest the money that was cancelled to in I don't know, education, social expenses, and now it's this nature conservation. The thing is that what is happening today is that this is happening with private creditors. So a country has a debt to bondholders, to the financial markets. They don't really know who it is. It's not even a bank. It's the financial markets. It's abstract thing. And what they do is they get another loan, cheaper, to buy back their debt at a discount, with a discount. Not even, it's complicated, not even a cancellation. So they have a debt which is valued in 100. So they buy it back by 70. And they commit to invest the 30%, this 30 that they didn't pay, into nature conservation. But this is all mediated by these big foundations like WWF or the Nature Conservancy, TNC, that are the ones that rule the conservation projects, as Esteban was saying, even displacing communities, erasing the sovereignty of the government over that territory. I was in an explanation. Belize is one of the countries that has done one of these debt swaps for nature, for ocean conservation. And the guy who was explaining it as a good solution said, and the good thing is that the government doesn't have majority in the board that decides where the money goes. And that was presented as a good thing. It's, well,
Yeah, no.
I mean, if you don't think that this is a good instrument, maybe you can explain how you see the relation between debt and climate. Or,
Sure, yeah. No, so obviously the solutions will never come from the top down. All of these institutions are totally co-opted by the fossil fuel industry, by international finance, COP. You know, the president of COP is going to be the president of the major global fossil fuel company. Last year in Glasgow, COP26 in Glasgow was sponsored by some of the biggest fracking companies in England. So it's disgusting. And Coca-Cola was sponsoring COP until the last minute in Egypt. So it's the biggest plastic polluter of the world. So we must build an alternative from the bottom up. The only truly potential to affect real change, any change at the level that we need, will only come from the bottom up, will not come from these institutions that we are discussing. So debt swaps are just one more attempt of the World Bank, the IMF, to dress themselves in green to pretend they're doing something to take the lead on the climate crisis, but they're not. They're just disguising themselves to continue doing more of the same. That's why we are building an alternative from the bottom up and from the most affected people of the world. So the connection between debt and climate is really important, because it's not only for the plundering of resources, but the fossil fuel industry continues to expand, the frontier continues to expand, and we have hundreds of carbon bombs in the global south. I come from Vaca Muerta. It's the world's second largest shale gas basin and fourth largest shale oil basin. It should not be touched, and it's being drilled at accelerating speed to provide Europe with cheap gas and to pay the debt. It's part of the agreement to get that. We got in one of the biggest debt of the world. We have the biggest loan ever in the history of the IMF worldwide, was granted to Argentina a few years ago, $45 billion. It's unpayable. And this is done so that we will have to extract oil, gas. We have offshore drilling now, deforestation, all kinds of extractive industries. So our communities are getting sacrificed, and the fossil fuel industry is advancing. What we are saying is we have trillions of dollars worth of fossil fuels in the ground in the global south that are getting quickly extracted to pay this debt. The debt is the driver. So if you can cancel the debt, we also have trillions of dollars of debt. It's a no-brainer. Cancel the debt so we can have a just transition. We can have a self-determined, sovereign transition that must be led by the workers, by the indigenous movements, and the climate and feminist movements, faith groups that can take part of this. It would be a struggle for power. It was not going to be granted down to us. It's going to be the result of putting enough pressure and international mobilization with people in Europe focusing on the centers of power. But that's the connection between debt and climate. And conversely, we have an opportunity to have unprecedented climate action and leave in the ground trillions of dollars worth of fossil fuels that otherwise would be getting extracted. That's why we see this as an incredible common denominator that can not only bring us all together with the groups that we need and we should be working with, but also give us a strategic direction under which we can build a movement that after taking this down can take on bigger and bigger challenges in the process of changing the system that is so unjust and exploitative.
Can I give three very short examples on how this, not just debt swaps, but how this debt renegotiation works in some cases. So one is an example of debt swap from Spain. Spanish government has done hundreds of debt swaps, the worst. They did one with El Salvador. There's another story with Cuba, but the El Salvador one is a very good one because they said, okay, we canceled this part of that, very, very small one, and you have to invest this money in education. And here is this Spanish company, Santillana, Editorial Santillana, that will provide the books that you need to buy for your educational project. This is a real story. Second story is Suriname. So Suriname has been in the fall for 2 years, negotiating with its creditor. It reached an agreement with the Western governments. It reached an agreement with India, not with China, and it's negotiating also with financial markets. And the financial markets, the BlackRock and other investment funds issued a statement. It's public. Issued a statement saying, we are not going to cancel or restructure Suriname's debt because Suriname has oil in its shores. We will lend them more money so they can exploit that oil and pay us back. This is the logic of debt that Jason was explaining. And the last case is Chad. Chad was the first case of a new scheme for debt resolution. This is how they call it, the common framework that the G20 came up with. Saying, okay, you go here and you negotiate with your creditors through this G20 scheme and you will get some debt cancellation and debt restructuring. So Chad got into that process and they had this debt with Glencore, which is a commodity trader, linked with the exploitation of oil as well. So the negotiations took some time, 1 year, 1.5 years. And after 1.5 years, the price of oil came up. So Glencore said, oh, your debt is no longer unsustainable because you have more revenues. Keep exploiting your oil and you'll pay us back. And they are presenting this case as a success because they restructured a little bit the debt from Chad, meaning that they enlarged the time in which Chad has to pay back. But the debt is the same, is exactly the same. And Glencore got higher interest rates. So this is how it works. They use the debt as a subordination, as Jason was saying, but as a very direct process to extract the resources from the country, not only the economic ones.
Expecting a question. All right, doesn't look good, the situation. Yeah. Yeah, we've learned that debt is used to maintain the current imperial world order, and at the same time, this colonial debt is perpetuated in the current system, but also hindering, well, the implementation of climate-adjusted policies. I don't know if you want to say something on this regard, like the relation of like international climate governance and debt, or what's the role there? What can the global south do? What do you propose, maybe? You know.
Yeah, what do I propose? Well, I think that, I mean, we can discuss proposals in a second, I suppose.
Yeah.
But the one thing I'd like to add, I guess, is that, look, I mean, the whole discussion of debt cancellation, I mean, I feel a bit uneasy about it in the first place, in the sense that the real debt is owed the other direction, you know? And I think that that's actually what we need to be like highlighting here, is that, I mean, we can talk about it in lots of different ways. If we just look at the empirical research that's being done on unequal exchange, I mean, the quantity of net appropriation from the South in terms of real goods every year is worth more than $10 trillion now, per year. I mean, that's an extraordinary quantity of goods that's just drained from the South. I mean, leaving people in conditions of underdevelopment and poverty, etc., in order to enrich Western firms. Then there's also climate debt, right? I mean, the global North countries, and overwhelmingly the ruling classes of the global North, are responsible for 92% of all excess emissions that are driving climate breakdown. So all emissions in excess of the safe planetary boundary result from over-emission in the rich countries, right? Where do the consequences of that fall? It falls in the global South overwhelmingly. You know, 80%, more than 80% of the damages associated with climate breakdown are suffered in the global South. And 98% of all climate-related deaths are suffered in the territories of the global South, right? I mean, the scale of the injustice is wild. And so we need to be talking about debt cancellation, yes, but also reparations, on several fronts, reparations. You know? And what is reparations, really? It's simply like, you know, a transfer of purchasing power over the global products. The production is occurring in the global South, and a transfer of purchasing power to the global South simply means that they get to consume or control more of the global product, their own resources, their own labor. You know, this is a fundamentally just intervention that we have to be fighting for. So, and also as was stated, I mean, look, when you owe a debt in foreign currency, then you have to do things to get that currency. And this is actually the key difference between the debts that the global North countries have, which are sometimes quite high, like the USA debt is quite high now, versus debts that global South countries have. Why is it that global South countries face this crisis, whereas global North countries don't? It all has to do with the degree of your currency sovereignty. So in the rich countries, they owe debts to themselves overwhelmingly, right? These are fiscal deficits that they just don't have to pay back, actually, or they can pay back simply by issuing their own currency, expanding the deficit if they want to. It's not a problem. For global South countries, if you owe debts in a foreign currency, you can't just print that currency, no? You have to do real things, extract your resources, sell them in international markets to obtain that currency to pay them back. So debt represents a literal transfer of real goods from the South to the North. That's what a debt payment is. That's what an interest payment is, a net transfer, de novo. So it has real consequences in the South. It forces certain kinds of economic decisions, whereas in the North it just doesn't. So yeah, in terms of solutions and proposals, I mean, absolutely, we must organize here. Our unions, the environmentalist movements, the NGOs must organize here to support debt cancellation urgently. But the truth is also, I think that it's much more likely that this problem will be resolved through mobilization among the global South countries, which is already occurring, right? And we saw the first hints of this in the 1980s with Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso. He's an extraordinary figure, and I urge you to read about him. But in the 1980s, he recognized debt as a form of neo-colonial power. And he stood up in the halls of the African Union and gave this extraordinary speech against debt where he said, look, if we don't pay the debts, nobody gets hurt, right? Debt is a fiction. We don't pay it, nobody gets hurt. If we do pay the debts, we're going to die, right? And we are dying. So the moral equation here is very clear. You don't pay the debts. And Sankara, when he gave this speech, I mean, it sent ripples through the crowd and stimulated this incredibly exciting movement of debt resistance across the continent and elsewhere in the global south. And immediately he was recognized as a threat for this. In his speech, he actually said, look, we have to default together. Because if Burkina Faso alone defaults, I will not be here next year to speak to you. Right? He knew. And 3 months later, after giving that speech, he was assassinated in a French-backed coup. Right? As a story, to the other global south leaders, you technically have the right to default on debt, but if you do, watch your back, right? Because this is not allowed. And Sankara's words, I think, they must remain with us. The key lesson we learn from that is solidarity. You do the defaults, and you do it in solidarity. You build those alliances between movements in the global north, movements across the south, progressive governments across the south, and you do it together. Because they can't assassinate us all. And these are Sankara's words. Yeah, look, I mean, this, by the way, I'll recommend a book briefly to you by my colleague, Jérôme Rousse from the LSE, who wrote a brilliant book called Why Not Default, where it goes through the history.
It's possible to find it here.
Where it goes through the history of
Great.
the history of how global south countries have used default as a successful mechanism in the past to renegotiate terms. This is a mechanism we have to explore again. We have to be radical enough for that. Of course, it does mean that temporary pain, but this kind of pain, as Yanis Varoufakis very wisely pointed out when he was trying to do the same thing for Greece, can be mediated significantly by taking steps ahead of time to reduce your dependence on foreign currency. You reduce your dependence on foreign currency by reducing your dependence on imports, right? So take steps to use industrial policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy to build sovereign industrial capacity, to provide for your country's needs as much as possible, and through regional trade. Okay, the key import categories are energy and food. Become as sufficient as possible in energy and food, and you limit your exposure to creditor backlash. Right? So we have to be smart about this. We have to build the movements that are capable of achieving this kind of thing, and it absolutely requires solidarity from all of you. I can't emphasize this enough. Whenever a global south leader or government will start taking steps in this direction, they will be immediately demonized in the Western media. Okay, you will come to believe that they are Satan, and so we have to build the capacity in our movements here to combat that kind of disinformation and to support global south governments when they need to take steps towards default for their own liberation. So that's the kind of international solidarity we need, and we have to build movements to achieve that. And remember, just my last words, like, there was a time in Europe when the unions in the global, here in Europe, were closely aligned with anti-colonial movements. When Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in the Congo, right? In Warsaw and Belgrade, mass demonstrations sacked the US and Belgian embassies, burned the furniture in the street. Right? That is what solidarity looks like. And it once occurred here in Europe. That's the kind of solidarity we have to rebuild if we want to achieve the kind of dramatic social and ecological transformation that is clearly required here.
Thank you. Esteban, do you agree with this proposal?
Absolutely. You just said all the things that I wanted to say and I didn't remember. But about Thomas Sankara, he inspired us to build a united front against debt from the global south. And basically that's exactly the line of thinking that we're following, that we must have a default, a concerted default by several countries. But how can we make it happen? No leader wants to become the next Thomas Sankara to be assassinated. So they're not, they don't dare to stand up against this power. The only way that we can do it is through building power from the bottom up to pressure these governments to default, and to default together. That's why it's important to build a movement internationally and to implement all of these ideas that we are discussing today into action. And I think we're at a university here today, and this is something that is important to say at a university, that university doesn't prepare you for this at all. They don't teach us any of this at all. We can learn a lot of great theories and stuff, but when it comes to movement building, power, about strategy, there's nothing like that. So this is what we are trying to focus on, and it's about self-learning and learning from the streets. The streets teach you something that cannot be learned in school. And you can know a lot, but maybe you understand nothing. The streets is about understanding, not so much knowing, or knowing how to apply what you know. So how are we going to put this into practice? Debt for Climate is a channel we're building for that, to do exactly what you just said. So I hope that we can work with all of you, because it will require a concerted international solidarity effort to make the dramatic changes we need.
There was another attempt beyond Sankara, which was the Cartagena Group. That was in the 80s in Latin America. And different Latin American countries came together and said, okay, if they have the Paris Club, which is the Creditors Club, we will build a Borrowers Club and negotiate as a bloc. And it was disintegrated by different strategies, particularly by the US. There is a very interesting CIA report that has just come up explaining how they used offers of lending, but also political destabilization and other instruments to break that. This might be happening again in terms of the building of a borrowers club, particularly from African countries. Not so much in Latin America, but African countries some African leaders are starting to talk to each other and building joint strategies. And the idea of a borrowers club is again on the table. And this is, I think, what scares creditors the most. But in order for those strategies to succeed, we need to build that solidarity movement. If there is no movement on the streets, if the pressure is not also on the streets, those political strategies, it's very difficult that they succeed. They also need to be blamed and shamed publicly, the creditors. I think we have an opportunity to raise our voices, particularly this year in October, the same week as the IMF and the World Bank will meet in Marrakesh. Debt movements all around the world are convening these global days of action for debt, economic and climate justice. There is a counter summit being organized by CDTM, ATTAC and Debt for Climate in Marrakesh. There is a People's COP that might be also happening those same days in Marrakesh, previous to the COP. There is a Global Inequality Alliance organizing the centralized actions throughout the whole week in different African countries. Is this going to happen in Europe? It depends on us. It's on us if we are able to organize mobilizations, actions, solidarity actions to support those calls. And I agree, the best like cancellation is debt repudiation. It's not paying. The best way for canceling the debt in terms of debt not being there anymore is stop paying. It's very difficult for one country to stop paying. It's easier if several countries do it. Argentina did default and stop paying, and in order to get back to the international community, they endured the worst of the revenges from the financial system. So if you leave that country on its own, the system will get back to that country with revenge, because it can only be called like that. But again, if the attempts for Borrowers Club succeed if people is on the street, if the call for debt repudiation or debt cancellation is out there, we might stand a chance. And debt repudiation by a diverse set of countries, or at least more than 2 countries, has the power to destabilize the system as well. And maybe it's that collapse of the financial system what we need to start building things differently also. But I agree with what Jason said. Greece couldn't do it because they didn't have the policies in place to be able to survive 1 week after the default. So you need the food, you need the energy, you need the medicines, you need to think about those industrial policies before you get to that point. And in parallel building that movement, international movement of solidarity. So yeah, it's on us.
And do you maybe, Esteban, want to add anything on what you're planning next, like from the campaign that for climate? I mean, Yolanda mentioned some things that perhaps you want to add.
Sure, yeah. So we're planning decentralized actions throughout the year. So if anyone is interested now, next month is the Macron Summit. There's a bunch of things happening, and the big one is, and the big one is the IMF World Bank Annual Summit in Marrakesh, where we are co-organizing the Counter Summit, but also organizing a global decentralized actions as well. So it'd be great if you join us. We can target different financial institutions throughout Europe as well. Yeah, if you want to join, just you can all get my number from the organizers. Also, just write us at info@debt4climate.org or follow us on @debt4climate. Is the handle.
Yeah, I kind of realized that we were so careful with time that we kind of finished earlier almost. But now we will open the floor for questions from the audience, and I'm sure there will be many. Before that, I will ask each of you to just in 1 minute try to sum up a takeaway from this talk. What can I do? What can we do? Yeah.
I think we already said it. It's time to get onto the streets, be informed, build this solidarity, not just movement but feeling. I think we sort of lost the global solidarity that we had in social movements in the early 2000s with the anti-globalization movement, where the center was this global South or North-South solidarity and South-South solidarity. And I think, and the last is, it's impossible to think about a real just transition without getting rid of the debt system. And I think that has to be embedded in I know there is a lot of people, students here from the Growth Master, this thinking about how the macroeconomics and the financial systems just impose the ways things are happening, also needs to be embedded. There's no growth possible without, or no the growth strategy possible without getting rid of the debt. So, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't have too much to add, but I guess I would say 2 things really briefly. The first is the importance of building alliances, I think, between movements right now. So, as we were discussing earlier, it's just so critically important that the climate movement start to build alliances with the labor unions and foreground core social demands that they have in terms of abolishing economic insecurity. The same is true the other way around. Like we need the labor unions also to shift to radicalize and to recognize that they should no longer see capitalist growth as the best way to achieve improvements in living standards and wages and economic security and employment, et cetera, that can and should be accomplished directly through policy, like universal public services, like the public job guarantee, like living wages, and so on. So we need to collectively mobilize around policies and objectives that will unite us. And into this mix, absolutely, the Global South must be absolutely central to this. Because no theory of revolutionary change in the world economy can ever be coherent or feasible without paying attention to the fact that all of the resources, well, the majority of the resources, the vast majority of the labor, are in the lands and the people of the Global South, right? That this realization has to be central if we want to accomplish a just transition, because that is where the power is at. That is where the people power is at. That is where the leverage is at, and we need to be thinking coherently about that. And so, if our movements are not connected to those struggles, reading their texts, platforming their demands, building alliances with them, then we're lost. I mean, really. So, read the People's Agreement of Cochabamba. Read the Red Deal. Unite with Debt for Climate movements. Think about the demands they're making and how can we integrate them into our struggles. I think this is really essential.
And just building on that, you can help us a lot from Europe. A lot of the European countries have a lot of weight in the IMF, in the World Bank. Germany, where I'm living, and where we did this action about the debt cancellation, because they got their debt cancelled 70 years ago this year. Half of the German debt was cancelled after the war that they caused. And then the other half, they were allowed to pay it back in their own currency, just as much as they could, depending on the industrial development. Conditions that would never be granted to any country in the Global South. It's quite the opposite. So there's something, and Germany today is the 4th largest voting power in the IMF. So if Germany would take the lead in initiating some of this, it would make great progress for us. And that depends on the people here in Europe. So you have there's a lot of power in your hands. There's a lot of change that you can affect if we can come together. And the beauty of this is that the Global South and the Global North can come together as equals. We're not going to do what you tell us. You're not going to do what we tell you. We can be equals. We can fight together for the survival of humanity in the face of the biggest crisis the world has ever faced. So thank you, and let's fight together.
Great, thank you. Now, I don't know, when I see a hand there, we can try to maybe ask 2 or 3 questions at the same time. And unfortunately, we only have one mic. Yeah. So we can take 3 questions in the room first, and then we look at the online questions. I don't know if there are people. Yes, perfect.
Yes, thank you. Great to be here with you all, and great to see you, Esteban, since Germany was participating with the Debt for Climate, with the alliance with the Scientists Rebellion last generation. It was really a pleasure to be there. And really, I have 2 questions that are glaringly obvious. Is like what role, and you already started to mention it, was what role and how do we fight back not against the militarism that is like the kind of the mechanism to stop Global South countries from fighting back in this way of defaulting on debt. And I'm just curious to know if you have any advice or thoughts already about how to link this with workers' movements in the Global North, as you've already mentioned as well. What the difficulty of getting labor unions to abandon this idea of economic growth. Yeah.
And there was another one here in the front, I think. We can take a couple. Yeah.
My question is about the default that you say. In Argentina, after 2001, we tried to make a default, but in this moment, we have another different context, political context. I mean, the correlation of force, political force in Latin America was different because, well, in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, Correa in Ecuador, in Argentina, well, start Néstor Kirchner in 2003, but now it's completely different. In Argentina now, the right is coming, and well, we have to Lula, for example. That's okay. But what happened? How we can make this the fall if we don't have the context to do it, because it's like a shoot on the field. No? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, also for your all your interesting contributions. I have a question according to the proposals of alliances. You talked a lot about labor union, but I would ask you about alliances with the feminist movement. We haven't talked about them in any cases, nor have we talked about female face of debt. So if you can just add this perspective, would be great.
We can perhaps now answer, and then we take another round, but we need to. Oh no, this one. Yes,
Okay.
yes. Sorry, I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's better because then at least I forget the questions I could start. So how do we get the labor unions in the global north? I think one way to do this is to explain that the same people that are exploiting us in the global south are pretty much the same people that are exploiting the working class in the global north as well. Instead of talking so much as I tend to do now, north and south, it's more to talk about the 1%, the Davos elites and their agenda, which involves that there is a disposable population of billions of people for them. And also by telling the labor unions that this, like debt cancellation, is something that is allowing them to take a protagonical role in the climate fight without shooting themselves in the foot. This is a movement that is not targeting them. Quite the contrary, it's a movement where they can take the protagonism that is meant for them to take in this fight before it's too late. It's just a vehicle. It's a device that we have found, that we built, where we can help accelerate the transition because there's no climate justice without social justice. Yeah? Then for Argentina, you said, how can we do this when the context is not there? Exactly, we must build the context. We must make the context. And by doing that, it has to come from the bottom up, and it will not be next week or next month. It will take years. From Debt for Climate, what we're doing is looking at a strategic horizon 2025. I told you about the Jubilee 2000 campaign. That was a really important campaign, and faith groups had a major role in there because the Jubilee year was the church year for the holy year of the church. 2025 is the next one, the Jubilee 2025. So we must find a way, and Lula at COP27 in Egypt, he called for the COP of 2025 to take place in the Amazon. So we are working to build a great convergence of forces towards 2025 of indigenous movement, labor unions, and the political leaders that might support us, like maybe Petro in the future, Lula, and build the context, build the situation, create the conditions that are not there today, and they will never be there unless someone builds them, but that must be us, the global south and the bottom-up people. And on your question on how debt affects women and the feminist perspective, as a man, I'm not the best to give you this. But we have had a webinar a couple months ago with Silvia Federici and leaders of the Ni Una Menos in Argentina movement. And it's a great webinar, it's fantastic. And it's online on the Debt for Climate channel, where they explain very well how debt affects disproportionately women who are usually doing the most precarious, the care work, and the austerity policies of the IMF, the World Bank, are usually imply cutting these jobs and cutting the social services and social benefits. So women are at the front line of the debt crisis, and Silvia Federici and the others can explain it much better than me, so I encourage you to watch that webinar.
Thanks for questions. On the workers' movement, I will add up to what Esteban said. The global movement for the defense of public services that is also being built. There was this meeting in Santiago de Chile last December, and there's a declaration, which is the Santiago Declaration, and it's a variety of organizations, social movements, and including workers' movements around the defense of public services globally, and that is the first threat for public services. So this is also a way, again, in addition to what Esteban said, to engage with them. On how to build different correlation of forces, I was in Brazil in 2002, right after the default in Argentina, and Lula wasn't in power, and Argentina had just defaulted, and Kirchner wasn't still in power, and then suddenly things started happening. You wouldn't expect it, but the powers in Latin America started changing. If you build a strong social movement that is not only focused on that, it's focused on the structural transformations that we need. These also it's not a mathematic thing, but it also facilitates for political changes to happen, and it's a long-term process. But Lula came to power later in 2002. Then Kirchner, then Correa afterwards, then Evo Morales, and then suddenly you had progressive governments in Latin America that you didn't have when Argentina defaulted. So maybe with that we can look at the future with more optimism if we think that we can actually create those correlation of that change in the correlation of forces. On the feminist, the alliances with feminist movement, it's key. The feminist movement has always been at the forefront of the fight against legitimate deaths, at the forefront against family deaths as well. I think it's not different today. They are at the forefront of the fight against austerity in many countries. We have also been doing some work with Global South movements and organizations and activists linking climate debt and gender justice and feminism, on how debt and climate are have a cumulative impact into not just only on women's rights and women's situation, but also on inequality, on increasing inequalities from an intersectional point of view. So I think it's already there. It needs to be more visible, probably. But yeah, it's already there. I left something out. Oh, sorry, that's me.
Yeah, so in terms of the feminist question, which is a really good one, yeah, there's, I mean, specifically we have to think about the way that structural adjustment impacts women. And there's an actually incredible literature on this that you can find pretty easily, showing very clearly that structural adjustment programs are like brutally sexist. I mean, they overwhelmingly negatively affect women in households. And that does need to be part of our discourse, I think, quite strongly. To the question of how to do defaults, I mean, this exercises me. I think about this a lot, and a lot of people are these days. I think that's okay. Look, I mean, if you simply default and keep everything else the same, you're going to be in trouble. I mean, it'll be very painful. And Argentina is an example of that. But so the point is not to keep everything else the same. The point is, again, to reduce your reliance on foreign currency and your reliance on imports from global north countries as much as possible. So you have to take steps to do that. And there's people thinking about this right now. I urge you to read Fadel Kabou and Ndogo Sampasia. There's a series of amazing economists in the global south who are exploring exactly how national currencies can be mobilized in the manner that modern monetary theory proposes to reduce dependence on foreign currency and imports. So these are crucial steps that have to be taken. I mean, look, if it sounds confusing to you, just think about it this way. Money represents control over production. Okay, that's all it is. I mean, like, our economy actually is only production, real goods and services. Money simply represents control over how productive capacities are used, how labor is used, how resources are used. If you rely for money on foreign currency or on foreign creditors, then you basically are bound into a situation where you are mobilizing production around what they want. Okay, that's why you're doing the extractivism. That's why you're setting up sweatshops to feed, T-shirts to Zara. The global south is not poor; it is rich. It's rich in people, it's rich in resources, it's rich in productive capacities, but it does not have control over them, right? Precisely because of rules in the structural adjustment program specifically that limit their ability to use their national currencies. These are like rules on fiscal expansion, on fiscal deficit use. Global North countries can use fiscal expansion all they want. Global South countries are literally prohibited by the rules of structural adjustment from doing that. There's an artificial scarcity of currency imposed on Global South countries so that they cannot mobilize their own productive capacities around meeting domestic needs. Instead, they have to mobilize around servicing northern accumulation. Okay? That is the relationship that has to be broken. And this is where MMT becomes so powerful. And Global South economists are drawing on these insights and advancing this field considerably, pointing out that it can be used as a tool of liberation. And I think this is a very exciting field of research that I would urge you to explore.
Perhaps now we could read out some of the questions from the online audience, and then we can get back to the room again. I don't know where the mic is.
A person called Patrick is asking, the SUR is being promoted as a common currency between Brazil and Argentina. Is this a potential solution or distraction for that liberation in the Global South?
Could we take a couple more and then?
I think the other ones that were asked have already been answered.
Okay.
We have more in the group.
Yeah, we can take it.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first one goes to Iolanda, and because you mentioned also that China is also now one of the heaviest creditors, let's say. And I wanted to, how would you compare how China gives loans to other let's say institutions or whoever? For instance, I heard also like a figure of interest rate, for example, like 20%, but I'm not sure how is it for China. No, 20% for the other creditors. This is the first question. And the second question goes to Johnson. First of all, thank you very much again for the whole explanation. But when it comes to the question of comparing, I mean, the whole question of the whole session today is comparing Germany to the Global South. And I understood it was very much clear for me the answer why the Global South is there is no cancellation for the debt. But it's the answer of why Germany get the cancellation is actually not clear. I mean, you can tell me exactly it's racism, of course, but it's still not that doesn't satisfy me in many ways. Because if you want to speak in, let's say, economical or economic terms, whatever, or even the economic policy, it didn't come only with the debt cancellation for Germany. I mean, other things also happened. And maybe we cannot only blame or let's say, thank the debt cancellation for the advancement or whatever development that Germany is in at the moment. Maybe you would say this is not important, but I think this is something that we also need to think about. Maybe simple questions can give us also momentum, but I think that's please help me. Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
There were two more. So you can take these three and then.
Yeah, there's three questions there.
Right, so I totally agree with the focus on the North-South relationship because of the historical contribution of imperialism towards climate change. But as we know, the Global South is not homogeneous, and I want to understand what is the role that can be played to tackle the challenges we have with two of the biggest state oil companies, which are actually Saudi Aramco and PetroChina, which are actually bigger than any of the Western private oil companies. So what is the role that can be played by Global South, by people in general, to actually challenge this other body of, let's say, threat to the climate, which seems to be, to me, largely independent of the IMF and the World Bank and the Western financial institutions over there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, these are really good questions. I want to first speak to the question of the currency relation between Brazil and Argentina. I mean, and then also now increasingly Brazil and China, right? This is super important. The more that the more that you rely on the U.S. dollar for trade of any good, even if you're not trading with the U.S., then the more you're reliant on creditors in U.S. dollars, right? To balance trade imbalances and so on, to fund imports and so on. Yeah? So the more you can avoid trading in the dollar, the safer you are from the influence that foreign creditors in the U.S., for example, or elsewhere in the core will have over you. So these are crucial steps, and they're very conscious in this sense. The increasing move towards de-dollarization, which is now a real buzzword in progressive global South circles, is serious. Now, look at the behavior that the White House has already exhibited towards this. I mean, they have issued the most aggressive, inflammatory statements against these moves. These are sovereign countries that have the rights to trade in currencies that they control. And yet the US already sees this as a threat, right? I mean, because what's going on here is, again, it's a threat to US hegemony, it's a threat to the imperialist arrangement. So again, we need to be supporting moves towards de-dollarization and defending governments that decide to do that. To the question of Germany, communism is the answer, right? Communism is the answer. You cancel Germany's debt because you know that if you continue to immiserate their working class and they shift communist during a period when communism is a viable alternative right there on the doorstep, then you lose control over Europe. And so it was strategic in terms of building the core, okay? Establishing North Atlantic hegemony. And you can see the same thing happening with other states that have been integrated into the core. Taiwan, South Korea, these are often pointed to as development miracles, right? I mean, they've been integrated into the core. The IMF considers them advanced economies. How did this happen, right? Because they had good governance and no. No, it's because they were allowed to use industrial policy. They were allowed to use tariffs and protectionism, right? They were allowed to use fiscal expansion. They're allowed to use progressive regulation in their markets in order to build economic power, because the US wanted them as a cordon sanitaire against revolutionary China, right? So they were integrated into the core purposefully. By the way, those policies that they used to develop, those very policies are denied to global South countries under structural adjustments. Those very same policies that we know work are denied to global South countries under structural adjustment, right? So Germany is an example of how the US makes exceptions to its own rules for the rest of the world in order to integrate countries for geopolitical reasons.
Sorry, I have to run, but Anna over there, she will tell me the answer to the question.
I also wanted to answer that because debt has been cancelled for geopolitical reasons in many occasions. So Iraq got most of its debt cancelled after the US invasion. Pakistan got a big chunk of debt cancelled when the support of Pakistan to the invasion of Afghanistan was being negotiated. Senegal got a debt cancellation by Spain in exchange of migration policies. So debt cancellation is being used as a geopolitical sweetener to reach agreements, and I think, yeah, the answer of communism is the best one, but it's a geopolitical tool, and they will continue to do this. In the case of China, so Chinese loans have lower interest rates than financial markets debt, but higher than the IMF and the World Bank. But Chinese loans come without policy conditions. So they normally come with trade conditions or with tight. So they come tied to the participation of Chinese companies in the building of infrastructures, or they come with what is called contingent liabilities. So they are guaranteed by natural resources or other assets in the country. So for instance, if Sri Lanka doesn't pay its debt back to China can have control over the port that it financed in Sri Lanka. These are tactics that the global north has used in the past, and China has learned from the best colonizers, and they are using them extensively. But they come without policy conditions, and governments in the global south, because of a structural adjustment, they prefer Chinese loans to anyone else's loans, even if they are a little bit more expensive than IMF or World Bank loans, because they come with more political freedom. You might be tied to the Chinese company or to selling China your oil, like for instance Ecuador has a Chinese loan that are guaranteed with the oil that Ecuador is exploiting. It's a different kind of conditionality. China is now like playing hard to restructure and cancel debts as well, but they are offering new loans, cheaper loans. So they are telling the countries, we won't cancel, but here's going to be refinancing of your debt at lower interest rates. And so, yeah, they are playing the game that the Western governments and the IMF and the World Bank have played in the past. They have like 1/3 of it's a little less than 1/3 of the global south debt, excluding obviously China, Russia, and Mexico. But the debt to financial markets, to bondholders, including BlackRock, Amundi, and other investment funds, is even bigger than Chinese ones, and interest rates are higher. Yeah, that was another question.
Yeah, and on the question of Argentina and Brazil, I think it's great to build alternative regional currencies, but I don't know about the perspectives for this one. The political situation in Argentina is shifting rightwards. There is a candidate that is a anarcho-libertarian capitalist who is, supposed to potentially win the election with the help of all the media and the oligarchy behind him. So if he comes, he's promising to dollarize the economy, to get rid of the peso altogether. So he's goodbye the sovereignty. Obviously, Argentina is running over 100% inflation. People are extremely exhausted after so many years of economic decline, and the debt is a big driver behind this. But I don't know. I hope that can come through, but I don't know about the perspectives in the short term. And then the question of the fellow who left, he was asking about the state-owned companies. How are they going to stop drilling? And I think, like before, we need to build the context. We need to build the global common sense where oil needs to be kept in the ground and gas and so on. And once we do that, then China or Saudi Arabia or other countries will become outliers if they continue doing what the others have ceased to do. So the West has a big responsibility. Europe has a big responsibility. It's colonized the world for 500 years, and to this day has largely controls the world. So what Europe does also sets the trend and the standards for others to follow. So let it be for a good cause for once in history.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if there are more questions. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. You mentioned the importance to relocalize energy and food production prior to defaulting from the debt in order to create some resilience locally. But how do you see this happening in the context where national economies and sovereign budgets are already between financial and international corporations, and where basically local governments have very little agency.
Thanks. My question was kind of about how the theory of change, if you like, that we're discussing is around like building movements and building kind of trade relationships that enable you to default. So kind of building structures that are outside of IMF and outside of the World Bank to kind of enable change. So I guess my question is more of a strategic one about the IMF and the World Bank. So for example, Deaf Climate is going to their meetup later this year. What do you see the strategic significance of going there to be if the theory of change is kind of ignoring them and building outside of them? And also, I guess, what's the role for them in the future, as you see it?
I'm not sure how to formulate the question exactly, but it's related to the trying to understand better where the balance of power lies when we know that the debt is mostly owned primarily to private entities, and then there are the loans that sort of cover it from IMF, World Bank, etc., and governments. And I'm trying to connect it in my head to movements that exist also to tax more heavily in the global north to create another form of redistribution. But connected to debt, it's like, obviously, if I would tax rich people to pay back debt, I would just be giving it back to these same people. No, it's like a stupid framing. But so, how exactly can we, as we put pressure on our governments to tax differently, how is that related to the debt question in terms of, how these private entities are accumulating that money, not just like lending it, but how afterwards what stays, but the money that gets created when you've made a loan, which is fictional in the first place, and then becomes real once you get the interest. How do we get that money back and put it somewhere where it makes sense, but not putting it to paying debt? I'm not sure if I've explained well the question, but trying to connect tax and debt, basically.
Thanks. Perhaps, Yolanda, you want to start?
Okay. I'm going to start with the last one. The first is that if you have a strong progressive tax system without illicit financial flows, you don't get so much indebted. So you don't rely on the financial market so much. But you're right that if I mean, which is what the IMF is recommending these days, which is fiscal consolidation, not just cut your expenses, but increase your tax revenue by increasing your VAT, which is the least progressive tax, to be able to pay back. How do we, I mean, okay, the only way of breaking that is to stop paying the financial markets. But there are middle options, including promoting legislation that would avoid from abusive actions from the financial markets. There is groups in the UK and in New York trying to promote legislation to protect borrowers that default on financial markets from being sued like Argentina was. So for instance, that's something, a bill is being introduced in New York. Most of the debt in the world is under New York or London law, and there is a movement in the UK to promote a similar legislation. The other one is regulation of the financial markets, but I don't know, it's quite naive, if you ask me. Definancialization, but if you keep relying on the financial markets, then you will keep be dependent on them. And I think one of the things that we need to take into account is that all this, I don't know if you heard about this Bridgetown initiative from Mia Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, or the Paris Macron Summit, or this calls for the World Bank reform. All of it, and the European Commission policies, is about de-risking. So putting public guarantees so countries can access financial markets. And this is the way that the development finance is going, so in the opposite direction that it should go. I'm gonna leave the industrial policies one to Jason.
Yeah, okay, so food and energy, let's talk about that. So I don't mean like necessarily like local food and energy, but national at minimum, okay? So let's think about land for a second. So the global south is very rich in land. The core economies depend utterly on the land mass of the global south for huge amounts of what we consume. I mean, everything from our clothes, the bananas and coffee and tea that we eat in the morning, this is not grown in Europe, okay? It's appropriated very cheaply from the land mass of the global south, not substitutable. Sugar, etc. So right now, huge tracts of land in the global south are being devoted to exports in these sectors. You're using the land to grow coffee and tea and sugar and cotton, soy, etc. To supply international global commodity chains that feed Western corporations. That very land, there's no reason that very land could not be used instead to provide nutritious food for the domestic population. By the way, many of whom, billions of people cannot access decent nutrition, right? Despite having rich, fertile lands right there. And so it's urgent that we need to be able to remobilize land away from supplying global supply chains towards supplying domestic nutritional requirements. For the vast majority of countries, there's no reason to not have 100% food sovereignty. Grains, vegetables, right? Like essential goods that people require for their nutrition. That can be achieved pretty easily. Again, MMT theorists from the global south are advancing the idea that you can do this simply by issuing a national currency, pay people to do this kind of farming domestically with your domestic land. Energy is a trickier one, right? Because, okay, if you have fossil fuel deposits, you can use fossil fuels. Otherwise, you're looking at renewables. But most poorer countries don't have the capacity to manufacture renewable infrastructure themselves. This is going to require some imports. You want to rely on regional trade as much as possible in order to obtain those. Okay, so get them from China if you can, to avoid a renewed dependency on imports for necessary renewable technologies. But once you have that kind of technology built up, then you're increasingly energy independent, and this significantly reduces your reliance on foreign currency. So these are two really key sectors. To the question of what to do with the World Bank and the IMF, there's basically two schools of thought. The first is like the long-standing demands from governments and social movements in the global south is democratize them, right? These are like, it's wild actually. These are fundamentally anti-democratic institutions where the US holds veto power over all major decisions. The G7 controls a majority of the vote in terms of policies that affect the global south. The global south has a small fraction of the vote in comparison. Even if they were all to unite and demand an end to structural adjustment conditionality, they would be easily overrun by the G7. Easily. Even the US alone could overrule that. So demands for democratization, we have to support. They should be fundamentally democratized. But there's a more radical school of thought that says, look, these institutions were set up with colonial intentions, they can't be reformed, and in the world we're building, we're abolishing them, right? Like the particular functions that the World Bank and IMF perform should be taken under, say, for example, the United Nations, where it can be like reconstructed in a properly democratic way, including, by the way, this is important, mechanisms for safe defaults. So that countries can default in a safe way if needed without being massively sanctioned and crushed by foreign creditors, right? We have to abolish this arrangement. It's cruel and imperialist. So I'm personally in favor of the latter, but in the meantime, also advocate for the former.
Also, in 2025, that it's the Jubilee year, there's probably going to be a Financing for Development UN conference. The first one was in Monterrey, and it was based on the foundations of democratizing economic global governance. And
well, maybe we can build also a movement, calling for not just IMF and World Bank, but because the G20 is playing the dice these days, even more than the G7, it's not just about democratization of these institutions, but building new institutions that are democratically defined and owned by the member states, and this is the UN.
Yeah, on what you asked about the strategy on why we go to Marrakech. So we're not ignoring, our strategy is not to ignore the IMF or the World Bank, but to target them. They are such great enemies to target. They are widely despised by the population of the world. When we were in Brussels last year, we had some event in Brussels, and then we went to try to find the IMF and World Bank in Brussels, in the center of the EU. We couldn't find them. They were on Google Maps, but they had no signs on the doors. They're hiding in plain sight. The IMF building in Brussels looks like a Soviet-era building with no paint, nothing even on the door. We could tell it was the IMF from a little sign behind the glass that had a tiny, tiny logo that said International Monetary Fund. We had to look at it almost with the lens. So the reason they're doing that is that they are really scared of being visible, of people targeting them, because they're widely criminal. So definitely it's a great strategy to target them. And that's also why you asked about BlackRock and the private creditors. So we're also targeting BlackRock and the others, but it's also strategic thinking that the IMF and World Bank, as well as being great enemies, great evils, great villains, also they are presumably democratically controlled by the G7, which are presumably democracies, right? Where if you can build power and pressure on the streets, you could eventually make them vote differently and take the lead on their cancellation. So we think that's the lowest hanging fruit or the weakest link in the chain. That's why we started with targeting the IMF and the World Bank, but we are not leaving out BlackRock and Vanguard and all the private ones, and also China and whatever creditors can become a problem. But we think that this is the best way to start to build a united movement against them, and where we have the highest choice, the highest chances at affecting some change and some debt cancellation for some countries.
Right.
I don't know if there are any other questions from the online audience. Should we take those very quickly and then we wrap up because it's late, as we can tell.
Okay, so there's 2 more questions. Argentina and Brazil have started to rebuild the UNASUR. Sorry. What would be the role of UNASUR, and might it be possible to foster just struggle through UNASUR? Also, to what extent do you feel it is necessary to build a new non-aligned movement so that repudiation can be used to force the issue of debt onto the global north institutions?
Actually, it's a good thing that we mentioned the non-aligned movements, because this is precisely what we need today, is to restore that. And look, there's several things here. First of all, we can't underestimate the power of the non-aligned movements in the 20th century in achieving really radical transformation in the world economy, right? Again, in the 1970s, this movement effectively brought about economic sovereignty to such an extent that it posed this very serious crisis for capital accumulation in the core states. That's real power, right? From the most oppressed and exploited part of the world. That's huge success. So we have to take inspiration from that. But, and this is an important point that goes to a question that was asked earlier. I don't know if it was ever responded to properly. The political landscape we face today is different from in the middle of the 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century, we're looking at a broad quorum of radical communist and progressive governments across, or at least nationalist across the Global South. These days, you have, a good chunk of Global South countries are governed by basically neoliberal comprador elites. And so you have an additional struggle against that class to overcome them and bring about significant political change within before you can kind of rebuild this kind of alliance, right? But it can start, and you can see the beginnings of it already. I mean, the relationships that are being built within Latin America, between Latin American countries and China. This is the start of something, I think. We see where it goes. But again, and I warned, nothing happens automatically. This takes movement building, it takes struggle, and that's what we have to be involved in.
Well, about UNASUR, it's an incomplete dream of Bolivar and San Martin, of a united Latin America, and many other leaders. One from Argentina who said 70 years ago, the year 2000 will find us united or dominated. And the prediction was completely accurate. It was Perón. So the 2000 found us dominated and divided, and UNASUR is an attempt to bring together Latin America. And maybe Brazil can take the lead on this, but also Latin American countries are very divided within. They have done a great job at polarizing society between left and right. And it's really difficult. The right is very, very fascist, very much pro-American, and they have a lot of power, a lot of concentrated power. It's also why it's difficult to do what you asked about, the industrial policy changes, because all of these things that in idea are correct and sound, they should be done. The reality is that any political leader that wants to change any thing in the game is facing extreme pressure and destabilizing attempts by the rural elites, by the different elites in the industrial makeup. So it's really difficult to make any changes and survive as a political leader in Latin America. But yeah, UNASUR is a step in the right direction, and it's gone back and forward many times, and hopefully someday it can become a reality.
I'm just going to end by saying that, for sure, I mean, I think it's key to build borrowers club and non-aligned countries movement, regional alliances in the global south, but we cannot put all the pressure into the global south, as my colleague Emilia Reyes from Mexico always says. We need to do our job also in the global north, and we need to put pressure on our governments, and we need to go into the street, and we need to show the solidarity. And if we don't do that, we will just be as destructive as they are. So.
Yes, thanks again, everyone. Yeah, just massive thanks for your contributions, Esteban, Iolanda, Jason, and Clàudia, for your wonderful moderation. Everyone here for your questions, also for the audience online. Sadly, we will have to leave now. All the buildings at the Webway close very early at 9. The occupation of Fossil, however, will not stop. So I would love to invite you all to come to Plaza Cívica, where the occupation is, and yeah, we could continue this important conversation. And yes, thanks a lot again for being here, and have a wonderful evening.